A shrill whistle split the brittle morning air, shattering the hush that clung to Willow Creek like frost. The train heaved itself to a halt in a cloud of steam and cinders, its iron heart still pounding. Eleanor Whittaker pressed trembling fingers to her battered carpetbag, the worn leather warm beneath her palm. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as she stepped down onto the splintered platform, her blue wool dress catching at her ankles in the restless wind. She was met by stares, dozens of them, heavy and unblinking. Whispers curled like smoke along the wooden planks. "That's the Boston bride," someone muttered. Poor soul. Eleanor set her jaw, knuckles white on the bag's handle. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the journey from the coast, but the reality of it, a stranger's town, a stranger's eyes, felt far colder than she had imagined. A tall man stood apart from the rest, hat in hand, his frame rigid with uncertainty. His dark hair, touched by the prairie sun, and the clean line of his jaw gave him a somber dignity. Sheriff Nathaniel Reed. The name was strange in her mouth, though she had written it so many times. He watched her with a gravity that made her heart flutter with dread. "Miss Whittaker?" His voice, low and careful, cut through the murmurs. Eleanor straightened, drawing up every reserve of composure she possessed. "Yes, I am Eleanor Whittaker." She offered him the letter, the seal broken and edges frayed from too many readings. Her hand trembled, despite her best effort. Nathaniel took the letter, his fingers grazing hers. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Whittaker." His gaze flickered, as if searching for something familiar in her face. He gestured to her bag. "May I?" She hesitated, then surrendered the bag. "Thank you, Sheriff Reed." His touch was gentle, yet he handled the carpetbag as if it might fall apart in his grasp. A boy darted past, eyes wide. "Is she really going to marry the sheriff?" Eleanor's cheeks burned. Nathaniel's lips pressed into a tight line. "Let's get you out of the wind," he said, leading her through the thin crowd. The townsfolk parted, their curiosity sharp and unkind. Eleanor felt the echo of Boston's grandeur recede behind her with every step. The walk to Nathaniel's home was a silent procession. The house stood at the edge of town, sturdy but plain, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. Mrs. Mabry, the housekeeper, waited at the door. Her sharp gaze flicked over Eleanor's dress, her hair, the mud on her boots. "So you're the new bride," Mrs. Mabry said, folding her arms. "We keep an orderly house here, Miss Whittaker." Eleanor summoned a polite smile. "I don't doubt it, ma'am. I hope to be of use." Mrs. Mabry's eyebrows arched. "We shall see." Nathaniel cleared his throat, shifting the carpetbag to the crook of his arm. "Mrs. Mabry, would you show Miss Whittaker to her room?" The house was tidy, the scent of soap and wood smoke lingering in the air. Eleanor's room overlooked the garden, its window rattling softly in the wind. She set her bag on the narrow bed, fingers brushing the faded quilt. The silence pressed in, thick and unfamiliar. That evening, supper was a quiet affair. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, his eyes flicking to Eleanor and away, as if afraid of what he might find. Mrs. Mabry served stew in heavy bowls, her lips pursed. Eleanor forced herself to eat, though every bite tasted of dust and loss. "Do you miss Boston?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tentative. Eleanor set down her spoon. "I miss my family, but Boston is not what it once was." She looked at her hands, twisting them in her lap. The war changed everything. A shadow crossed Nathaniel's face. It did. Night fell swift and absolute. In her room, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, letter of marriage clutched tight. The darkness pressed against the window panes, filled with the ghosts of memory. Her brother Samuel's laughter, sharp and bright, then silenced by war. She drew her knees to her chest, swallowing the ache in her throat. Somewhere in the house, floorboards creaked. Eleanor pressed her palm to her heart, bracing herself against the unfamiliar walls, the weight of all she had lost, and the uncertainty of what she might find here. Down the hall, Nathaniel paused outside her door, hand hovering just above the wood. He listened to the hush, to the sorrow that filled the house. He turned away, jaw set, and descended the stairs into the dark. Eleanor closed her eyes, the letter still warm in her grasp, and wondered if hope was enough to see her through another night in Willow Creek. Morning would come, whether she was ready or not. Eleanor awoke to the clatter of pans and the low rumble of voices drifting up from the kitchen. The dawn light, pale and uncertain, crept across her bedroom floor, illuminating the battered carpet bag and the marriage letter resting atop it. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar cadence of Nathaniel's house. The scent of baking bread and wood smoke mingled with the faintest trace of lavender from the quilt beneath her chin. Her limbs ached with exhaustion, yet her mind whirled, restless as the wind that battered the window panes. She dressed carefully, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons of her plain blue dress. Each detail, each motion, was a small act of defiance, a refusal to let her sorrow swallow her whole. Downstairs, Mrs. Mabry presided over the kitchen like a wary general, her sharp eyes never missing a thing. Nathaniel sat at the table, hat already in hand, the morning paper folded and untouched before him. "Good morning, Miss Whitaker," Mrs. Mabry said, her tone more perfunctory than warm. She slid a plate of eggs and bread onto the table. "Best to eat hearty. There's work to be done." Eleanor nodded, murmuring her thanks. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, but he looked away just as quickly, as if the act cost him something. The meal passed in a silence punctuated only by the scrape of cutlery and the ticking of the parlor clock. Eleanor tried to make conversation. "Willow Creek seems peaceful," she ventured. Nathaniel's mouth twitched. Peaceful enough most days. He glanced at Mrs. Mabry, then back at his plate. "The townsfolk take time to trust newcomers." Mrs. Mabry snorted softly. "Especially those from Boston." Her gaze sharpened. "Folk here don't care for city airs or fancy ways." Eleanor set down her fork. "I have no wish to bring Boston here. I only hope to find my place." Mrs. Mabry wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, you'll find the sheriff's reputation is not as simple as it seems. Folks talk. It would do you well to listen." Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she nodded. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor glimpsed the shadow behind his eyes, a flicker of something wounded and wary. Later that day, Eleanor ventured into town alone, determined to prove herself useful. She carried a basket on her arm, its contents a feeble attempt at hospitality, a loaf of Mrs. Mabry's bread, a jar of preserves, heads turned as she passed. Conversations dropped to whispers, faces closed and wary. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Granger eyed her with thinly veiled suspicion. "We don't see many ladies from the East here. How are you finding our little town?" Eleanor summoned a smile. "It's different from Boston, but I hope to make it my home." Mrs. Granger leaned in, her voice low. "Best mind your manners. Some say the sheriff's been unlucky with women before." The implication hung in the air. Eleanor kept her composure, but her heart hammered. "Thank you for the advice." On the way back, children stared at her from behind fence posts, their laughter sharp and uncertain. Eleanor walked faster, her shoes kicking up dust. That evening, she and Nathaniel dined together in the muted glow of lamplight. The formality between them felt insurmountable, each word chosen with care and caution. "Have you always lived here?" Eleanor asked, her voice tentative. Nathaniel nodded, twisting his napkin in his hands. "Born and raised, left for the war like most men." He hesitated, eyes flicking to the window. "Came back to something less than I left." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I lost my brother, Samuel. He was only 20. Nathaniel's gaze softened, pain flickering in its depths. "I'm sorry. Thank you." She wanted to say more, to breach the gap between them, but the silence pressed in again. Nights brought little rest. Eleanor often woke to the sound of Nathaniel's footsteps in the hallway, or the muffled cries that slipped from his room. Once, she glimpsed him in the moonlight, sitting at the edge of his bed, face buried in his hands. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the way his shoulders hunched beneath invisible burdens. One Sunday, church bells pealed across Willow Creek, drawing the townsfolk together in wary communion. Eleanor walked beside Nathaniel, her gloved hands folded tightly, The congregation parted to let them pass, and she felt the weight of every gaze. "Did you hear? She married him after only a handful of letters," one woman whispered. "Desperate, I'd say, or foolish." Eleanor held her head high, but inside she shrank beneath their scrutiny. Nathaniel offered her his arm, but his expression was unreadable, the line of his jaw set in stone. After the service, Pastor Willoughby greeted them with forced cheer. "Welcome, Mrs. Reed. We pray you find happiness here." "Thank you, Pastor," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. As they walked home, Nathaniel's silence deepened, his steps heavy on the frozen earth. Days blurred into one another. Eleanor busied herself with chores, laundering linens, scrubbing floors, tending the small patch of garden. Mrs. Mabry watched her with a mixture of skepticism and grudging approval. One afternoon, as Eleanor folded sheets in her room, Mrs. Mabry appeared in the doorway, a letter in hand. "This came for you," she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The handwriting was her mother's, though weaker than she remembered. The words blurred before her eyes. Her mother's health was failing. The pain and worry pressed in, sharp as a knife. She sat on the edge of the bed, the letter clutched to her chest. Nathaniel knocked softly, his silhouette framed in the doorway. "Bad news?" His voice was rough, uncertain. "My mother." Eleanor's voice broke. "She's not well." Nathaniel shifted, uncertainty flickering across his face. "If you need to go back, I'll help however I can." She shook her head. "There's no money for the journey." And she said not to worry. "But I do." Nathaniel nodded, the words he wished to say left unsaid. He lingered a moment longer, then turned away, leaving Eleanor with her sorrow and the sound of the wind at the window. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She wandered the halls, drawn by a strange restlessness. The house was silent, but for the creak of floorboards and the distant cry of an owl. In Nathaniel's study, the door stood ajar. Eleanor hesitated, then slipped inside, her bare feet muffled by the rug. Books lined the shelves, their spines faded with age. Papers cluttered the desk. On its surface lay a battered tin box, its lid askew. She reached for it, her heart pounding. Inside, a tarnished medal gleamed in the lamplight, a relic of the war, its ribbon frayed. Beside it lay a folded letter, the paper worn thin at the creases. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Samuel. Her brother's name leapt from the page, the ink smudged by time and grief. A wave of dread crashed over her, cold and suffocating. Why had Nathaniel kept this? What had passed between him and Samuel on those distant battlefields? Footsteps sounded in the hall. Eleanor snapped the box shut, her hands shaking. She slipped from the study, heart racing, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. In the darkness of her room, she pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, searching for answers in the silent prairie night. The secrets between her and Nathaniel had grown deeper, more tangled, and she could not help but wonder what truth might lie waiting in the shadows of Willow Creek. The prairie wind rattled the window panes as Eleanor pressed wildflowers into a book, her fingers nimble despite the chill in the air. The days in Willow Creek had taken on a rhythm unfamiliar, but no longer unbearable. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Mabry with baking and laundry, and by mid-morning, she walked the dusty lane to the schoolhouse, her skirts trailing dew from the tall grass. The schoolroom was a clapboard box filled with mismatched desks and the scent of chalk dust. Miss Pauline, the teacher, greeted Eleanor with a surprised but grateful smile. "I heard you'd come from Boston. We're always in need of another pair of hands," Pauline said, handing Eleanor a stack of primers. Eleanor's heart fluttered at the chance to prove her worth. She read aloud to the children, her gentle accent drawing their attention, and guided their small, ink-stained hands over sums and letters. The children grew fond of her stories, and even the shyest girl, little Ruthie, reached for her hand as the class spilled outside for recess. In town, Eleanor's presence began to soften suspicion, but whispers still trailed her like shadows. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Granger's tone thawed only slightly. "You've taken well to country life, Mrs. Reed. Not all city ladies manage." Eleanor offered a tight smile. "I have little choice but to make the best of it." She heard the gossip when they thought she was out of earshot. Nathaniel's name was often on their lips, spoken with a mix of awe and unease. "They say the sheriff was a captain in the war. That skirmish at Cold Spring, he was in command. Didn't her brother die there? Imagine marrying the man who..." Eleanor's hands would clench around her basket until the knuckles blanched. She longed to confront Nathaniel, but every attempt faltered beneath the weight of his silence. At home, she worked alongside Mrs. Mabry, peeling apples for pies and mending shirts by lamplight. The older woman's wariness ebbed, replaced by a grudging respect. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that," Mrs. Mabry remarked one evening, sliding a pie into the oven. "Most would have packed up and run by now." "I'm not most," Eleanor replied, her chin lifted. Mrs. Mabry grunted, but her eyes warmed. "No, you're not." Yet the ache of unanswered questions gnawed at Eleanor. Over supper, she watched Nathaniel's hands, broad and scarred, as they broke bread or turned the pages of the local gazette. She gathered her courage one evening, after Mrs. Mabry had retired, and only the hush of the house remained. "Nathaniel," she began, her voice careful, "the townsfolk speak of Cold Spring, of your part in the war." He stiffened, gaze fixed on the flickering lamp. "They talk too much. I only want to understand. My brother Samuel, he fell there. I found a letter in your study." His jaw clenched. "You shouldn't go through my things." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she pressed on. "Why do you keep his letter?" "What happened between you?" Nathaniel rose abruptly, pushing back his chair. "The past is best left where it lies, Eleanor. It brings nothing but pain." He left her alone in the pool of lamplight, the silence louder than any accusation. Nights grew colder. Sometimes Eleanor woke to the sound of Nathaniel's nightmares, harsh, muffled cries that faded before she could reach his door. He drifted through the house like a ghost, careful and distant, his attempts at kindness tinged with guilt. One afternoon she found him repairing a fence at the edge of their property. The wind whipped his coat and ruffled his dark hair. She watched him from a distance, longing to bridge the gap. But when he noticed her, he only nodded, his expression unreadable. In town, Nathaniel shielded her from the worst of the gossip. He walked her home from the schoolhouse, his presence a silent warning to those who whispered too loudly. Yet his protectiveness was as much a barrier as a comfort. The harvest dance arrived on a night of brittle stars and music that spilled from the town hall. Mrs. Mabry insisted Eleanor attend. "Folk need to see you're not afraid of them," she said, tying Eleanor's hair back with a ribbon. The hall was awash with lantern light and laughter. Eleanor stood on the edge of the crowd, uncertain, until Miss Pauline drew her into a reel. The rhythm of the dance and the warmth of the townsfolk eased something in Eleanor's chest, though she still felt the press of curious eyes. It was then that Lila appeared tall and striking, with auburn hair and a gaze that could flay. She stepped close, her perfume sharp as a warning. "You must be Eleanor," Lila said, her smile thin. "I thought Boston women would be more formidable." Eleanor held her ground. "I'm not here to impress anyone." Lila's eyes glittered. "Nathaniel and I grew up together. There are things about him you don't know, things that ruin a person, secrets that fester. I'd think twice before staking your happiness on him." Eleanor's breath hitched, but she refused to look away. "Whatever secrets he keeps, they are his to share. I will not be cowed by gossip." Lila's lips curved in a knowing smile. "We'll see." She vanished into the crowd, leaving Eleanor shaken but defiant. Later, as the music faded and couples drifted into the night, Eleanor lingered at the edge of the lamplight. The loneliness pressed in, heavier than ever, but her resolve only deepened. She would not be frightened away by shadows or haunted by whispers. She watched Nathaniel from across the hall, his broad shoulders bowed beneath invisible burdens. The mystery of Cold Spring, of Samuel's death, loomed between them, a chasm she could not cross. Yet Eleanor's spirit would not yield. She would find the truth, whatever it cost. In the hush of midnight, as she walked home beneath a sky thick with stars, Eleanor swore to herself that she would uncover the secrets of Willow Creek and of the man she had married. The answers were there, hidden in the silence, and she would not rest until she found them. A brittle silence had settled over the house, the kind that pressed into every corner, smothering even the crackle of the kitchen hearth. Eleanor moved through Nathaniel's home like a restless ghost, her mind swirling with half-formed questions and memories that would not quiet. She had learned to avoid the study, its shelves heavy with unread stories, its desk a graveyard of secrets. But on this cold, rain-blurred afternoon, Drawn by a force she could neither explain nor resist, she found herself before the half-open door. Inside, the room was cloaked in the blue-gray light of approaching dusk. She hesitated, then stepped in, her skirts brushing the floorboards. Nathaniel was out, tending to a call at the edge of town. Mrs. Mabry's voice echoed faintly from the kitchen, humming a hymn as she kneaded bread. Eleanor's gaze fell to the battered tin box atop the desk. She reached for it, breath quickening. Beneath the war medal and Samuel's letter, she discovered a slim, leather-bound journal, her brother's name, Samuel Whitaker, etched in a careful, boyish hand. Her knees weakened. She sank onto the edge of the desk chair, heart in her throat. She opened the journal, and the past rushed up to meet her in Samuel's looping script. April 1863. Camp is cold, the men are restless, but Nathaniel Reed keeps order. He's fairer than most officers I've known. May 1863. Skirmish near the river. Nathaniel stood by me when others faltered. We spoke of Boston, of home. He misses his mother's bread. I told him about Eleanor's jam tarts. The entries grew darker, ink blotted with fear. October 1864. We march tomorrow. Nathaniel is troubled. Rumors swirl. Cold Spring will be bloody. I'm afraid, but I trust him. The final entry ended abruptly, the words trailing off mid-sentence, as if Samuel had been called away and never returned. Eleanor closed the journal with trembling hands. The room spun, her breath shallow. She pressed her palm to her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. So many secrets, so much pain, hidden right beneath her nose. She barely remembered stumbling from the study. When Nathaniel returned, rain-soaked and weary, she was waiting for him in the parlor, the journal clutched to her chest. He froze, the door swinging shut behind him. His eyes went from her face to the book in her hands, and she saw a flicker of dread settle over his features. "You kept this from me," she whispered. "All this time." Nathaniel closed the distance, but not enough to touch her. "Eleanor." "Why?" Her voice broke, raw with anguish. "You told me nothing." "You let me wonder, let me suffer, when all the answers were here." He looked away, jaw tight, rainwater dripping from his coat. "I never meant." "Then tell me what happened at Cold Spring." She thrust the journal toward him, her fingers white around the leather. "Tell me what you did." Nathaniel's shoulders sagged. For a moment, she saw the soldier beneath the sheriff, the man who had survived 1,000 nights like this one, only to find himself on trial before the woman he had hoped to save. "I was there," he said, his voice gravel and regret. "I led the company. Your brother, Samuel, was under my command." Her breath caught. "Did you kill him?" Nathaniel flinched as if struck. "No, not with my own hand." He looked her in the eyes, unflinching. "But I gave the order to advance. We were surrounded, pinned down by gunfire. The men were terrified. I had to make a choice." He swallowed, his hands shaking. "Samuel volunteered for the flank. He was braver than I was. I told him to hold until help arrived, but the enemy was waiting. He never came back." The words hung between them, heavy as lead. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she sank onto the settee. Rage and grief warred within her. "You gave the order," she whispered. "You sent him to his death." Nathaniel knelt before her, his eyes rimmed with pain. "Every night since, I've relived that moment. If I could trade places with him, I would. I cared for Samuel. I cared for all of them." She recoiled, as if burned. "You cared? You let me marry you. You let me live in this house, eat your food, while you hid the truth." His voice broke. "I didn't know how to tell you. I hoped you'd never know." Eleanor's vision blurred. "You lied to me." He reached for her hand, but she wrenched it away. "Please, don't touch me." Her voice was ice. Nathaniel bowed his head, defeated. "I am sorry, Eleanor, more than you can know." She stood, fists clenched, the journal pressed to her chest. "Sorry is nothing. Sorry won't bring Samuel back. Sorry won't mend what you broke." She turned and fled, the house echoing with the sound of her sobs. Upstairs, she locked herself in the spare room, the walls close and unfamiliar. She could hear Nathaniel's footsteps in the hallway, his voice calling her name, but she pressed her hands over her ears and wept until exhaustion claimed her. For days, A frigid truce gripped the house. Meals were silent affairs, the clink of cutlery louder than words. Nathaniel tried, in faltering ways, to explain. He left notes at her door, flowers from the garden, offerings that only deepened the ache inside her. Eleanor answered with silence, her face turned from him at every opportunity. Mrs. Mabry, sensing the storm, grew gruff and protective. "You don't have to talk to him if you're not ready," she whispered one morning, handing Eleanor a mug of tea. "But you can't run from pain forever." "I'm not running," Eleanor replied, her voice brittle. "I'm trapped." And it was true. Her mother's illness loomed in every sleepless night, a chain she could not break. She had no money for the journey home, no prospects, no hope beyond the prairie's endless horizon. Even if she left, where could she go? Nathaniel haunted the margins of the house, a shadow of the man she had tried to love. She saw the toll her anger took on him, the hollowness of his cheeks, the deepening lines at his brow. Sometimes, late at night, she heard him pacing the yard, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. One evening, as a storm battered the windows, Nathaniel lingered outside her door. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I know I can't undo what I've done, but you deserve the truth. If you want me to leave, I will. Or if you wish to stay, I'll give you the space you need. I'll do whatever you ask." She stared at the closed door, words warring on her tongue. She wanted to scream, to demand answers until her voice failed. But grief was a wave, relentless and suffocating, and she could do nothing but let it crash over her. Days passed. The town gossiped. The children at the schoolhouse watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, and Mrs. Mabry kept a careful, watchful silence. Eleanor's world had shrunk to the cold walls of her room, the ache in her chest, and the journal she read and reread until the pages blurred. Yet even as anger burned, a seed of doubt began to grow. Samuel had trusted Nathaniel once. The letters, the memories, they spoke of a friendship forged in fire. Was it possible to hold two truths at once? That Nathaniel had sent her brother to his death and that he had mourned him ever since? Eleanor did not know. The question gnawed at her, restless as the prairie wind. One night, as thunder rolled over Willow Creek, Eleanor rose from her narrow bed and pressed her forehead to the window. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the silhouette of Nathaniel in the yard below, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of regret. She watched him for a long moment, torn between fury and pity. She could not forgive him, not yet. But neither could she leave, not with her mother's letter hidden beneath her pillow, not with the past so tangled and unfinished. The storm raged on, and Eleanor listened to the beat of her heart, steady and defiant. Tomorrow would come, bringing with it choices she could not yet name. And somewhere in the darkness, the truth of Samuel's, Nathaniel's, and her own waited to be faced. As dawn crept over the prairie, Eleanor drew a breath and wondered what she would choose when the day demanded it. Eleanor rose each morning before the sun, the hush of the house pressing close as she dressed by the faintest light. She moved quietly through Nathaniel's home, careful not to disturb the silence that had grown thick between them. If she caught a glimpse of him, broad-shouldered and weary in the hallway, she turned away, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. Conversation had become a brittle, unnecessary thing. She ate her meals at the edge of the table, exchanged only the briefest of words with Mrs. Mabry, and vanished the moment the dishes were cleared. It was at the schoolhouse that Eleanor found a breath of peace. The children's chatter, the chalk dust, the scent of ink and old wood, these things offered a world untouched by betrayal or regret. She poured herself into the lessons, her voice gentle but firm, as she guided small hands over their letters and numbers. Among the children, one drew her heart especially. Clara, a slight, brown-haired girl with wide, solemn eyes and a shyness that clung to her like a second skin. Clara's parents had perished in the fever that swept through Willow Creek the year before. Now she lived with a distant cousin who barely spoke to her. Eleanor saw herself in the girl's quiet ache. During the lunch hour, while other children tumbled in the yard, Clara lingered at her desk, tracing shapes in the dust. One day, Eleanor knelt beside her. "Would you like to help me tidy the books, Clara?" Eleanor asked, her tone light. Clara nodded, a hint of hope flickering in her gaze. They worked side by side in companionable silence. When Clara finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "Miss Whittaker, did you ever miss your mother when you were little?" Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes, I missed her very much. Sometimes I still do." Clara nodded, and Eleanor's heart twisted with tenderness. At home, Nathaniel's presence became a quiet reassurance, though Eleanor would not acknowledge it. She noticed his silent efforts, the woodpile stacked higher than before, the porch steps mended, the kitchen floor scrubbed on mornings she'd barely slept. Once, she watched him from the parlor window as he returned from town, the brim of his hat pulled low, jaw set with determination. Later, she overheard him at the Mercantile, his voice steady as he deflected rumors. "My wife is a good woman," Nathaniel told Mrs. Granger, loud enough for others to hear. "She's owed respect, same as any here." Eleanor's cheeks burned at the memory, torn between gratitude and resentment. Mrs. Mabry noticed the rift and, in her way, tried to bridge it. She pressed a cup of tea into Eleanor's hands one grey afternoon, her manner brusque but her eyes kind. "You're a stubborn girl," Mrs. Mabry said, "but so is the sheriff. He carries more pain than most. Lost his brother in the war. Lost half his men at Cold Spring. He's not the villain you think." Eleanor bristled. "He hid the truth. He let me believe." "He let himself believe he could outrun the past," Mrs. Mabry interrupted. "But pain finds us, no matter how far we run." "Don't blind yourself to another's sorrow, Eleanor." Eleanor said nothing, the words gnawing at her as she retreated to her room. The days drifted by, the prairie thawing slowly into a green that seemed impossible after so long a winter. Eleanor clung to her routines, fearing the collapse of what little order she had left. But when the letter arrived, creased and stained, her mother's name scrawled on the outside in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, her carefully built walls crumbled. She tore it open in the garden, her back to the house. The words inside struck like a blow. Her mother had passed, the illness swift and unmerciful. The letter, written by a neighbor, offered only the barest comfort. She had gone peacefully, they said, and sent love to Eleanor in her final days. The world spun. Eleanor pressed her forehead to her knees. The letter crumpled in her fist. Grief poured through her, raw and unstoppable, a flood of loss that threatened to drown her. She did not hear the footsteps on the path or the creak of the garden gate. It was Nathaniel who found her, crouched amid the tangled sweet peas. He hesitated at first, his shadow falling across her bent form. "Eleanor?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. She did not answer. The sobs came harder, tearing through her like a storm. Nathaniel moved closer, kneeling beside her in the dirt. For a long moment, he said nothing, only rested a tentative hand on her shoulder. At last she looked up, her eyes red, lashes spiked with tears. "She's gone," Eleanor choked. "My mother, she's gone." Nathaniel's features softened. He reached for her hand. This time, Eleanor did not pull away. She let him take her fingers in his, let herself lean against his shoulder, her grief too heavy to carry alone. "I'm so sorry," Nathaniel murmured. "I know what it is to lose family. I know how the emptiness follows you." Eleanor closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. "It never leaves, does it?" He shook his head. "No, but you find ways to live with it. Some days are harder than others." They sat together as the sun slipped behind the clouds, the air thick with the scent of earth and new grass. In that silence, their shared sorrow bridged the gulf between them, if only for a heartbeat. Eleanor felt the ache in her chest ease just slightly, as Nathaniel's warmth steadied her. As dusk crept in, she let herself rest against him, neither forgiving nor forgetting, but no longer alone in her grief. It was a fragile peace, born not of understanding but of loss, a truce held together by the memory of those they had both loved and lost. Night gathered around the garden, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor wondered if, after so much pain, hope might still be possible. The prairie wind whispered through the sweet peas, carrying secrets and promises yet unspoken, reminding her that the story between them was far from over. Winter arrived on the wings of a north wind, sweeping down from the hills and over the frozen prairie. binding Willow Creek beneath a hard crust of ice and snow. The world narrowed, each day shrinking into a realm of creaking floorboards and frosted window panes, where the warmth of the hearth became the only true defense against the cold's relentless assault. Within Nathaniel's house, the long, bitter nights forced Eleanor and Nathaniel into uneasy proximity. The walls that had divided them became, by necessity, thinner. There was nowhere to go but into each other's company, two souls sharing the same flickering lamplight, the same silence broken only by the snap and hiss of burning logs. At first, Eleanor kept her distance, occupying herself with mending, reading, or lessons for the school children she could no longer see each day. Nathaniel spent long hours at his desk, writing reports for the governor or scanning the town's ledgers by firelight. Yet as the cold deepened, so too did the need for conversation, for the simple comfort of another voice in the gloom. One evening, as the wind howled at the eaves and the windows rattled in their casings, Nathaniel paused at the threshold of the parlor where Eleanor sat with her sewing. He lingered, hat in hand, his face pale in the lamplight. "Would you mind if I joined you?" he asked, his tone careful. Eleanor nodded, her hands never pausing in their work. He settled across from her, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. "Do you remember your first snowfall?" he asked, a wistful note in his voice. Eleanor considered, her needle pausing. "I do. I must have been 7. My brother Samuel and I built a fort in the garden. My father pretended to be a raider, and we pelted him with snowballs until he surrendered." She almost smiled. "He let us win, of course." Nathaniel's gaze softened. "I remember my first too. I was 5. My brother Jacob dared me to taste the icicles off the barn. I slipped and broke 2 teeth. Mother fussed for days. Laughter, genuine and warm, spilled between them, softening the edges of old wounds. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt the tightness in her chest ease. As the days passed, the pattern repeated. Sometimes, in the deep blue of early morning, Eleanor would find Nathaniel tending the stove, coaxing flames from stubborn embers. He would offer her coffee, and they would speak of small things, recipes, weather, the antics of townsfolk. Other nights, they lingered over supper, sharing stories of their childhoods. Nathaniel's misadventures with his brother, Eleanor's recollections of Boston's bustling streets, and her mother's gentle hand. But always, beneath the surface, ran the current of grief and regret. One night, as sleet battered the glass, and Mrs. Mabry retired early with a headache, Eleanor found Nathaniel seated by the fire, his expression distant. She sat beside him, drawn by an impulse she could not name. He stared into the flames. "Do you ever count the things you regret, Eleanor?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. I try not to dwell." He looked at her, the firelight throwing his scars into sharp relief. "I count them every day. Not just Samuel, but all the men under my command. Some were little more than boys. I gave the orders, and they followed me straight into hell." Eleanor's anger, which had once been so sharp, softened at the rawness in his voice. "I thought if I could just be a good sheriff, a good husband, perhaps I could make amends. But every night I see their faces, I hear their voices. I wonder if I might have saved one more, or spared a mother's grief." She laid her hand atop his, tentative but steady. "You did what you thought was right. War demands impossible choices." Nathaniel met her gaze, vulnerability naked in his eyes. "I wish I could believe that." The moment lingered, aching, fragile, before Eleanor withdrew her hand, uncertain, afraid to cross a line she was not ready to name. Outside, the world was changing. Influenza crept through Willow Creek like a silent thief, stealing into homes and laying low the strong as well as the frail. The schoolhouse closed its doors. Pauline, the teacher, fell ill, and Mrs. Granger's youngest was racked with fever. Eleanor could not stand idle. She brewed willowbark tea, mixed poultices, and spent long hours tending the sick with a calm resolve that surprised even herself. Nathaniel joined her, carrying supplies from house to house, bracing those too weak to walk, reading scripture to the dying. Together, they worked through the long fever-ridden nights, their hands often brushing as they adjusted blankets or measured doses. In those moments, their partnership became seamless, two halves moving as one, wordless but understood. In the eyes of Willow Creek, Eleanor's transformation was complete. Suspicion faded, replaced by gratitude and respect. Mrs. Granger pressed her hand in thanks. Old Mr. Dobbins, gruff and stubborn, tipped his hat and called her our Boston angel. Even Lila, her voice softer now, offered a nod of approval. As the worst of the sickness passed and the days crept slowly toward spring, Eleanor and Nathaniel found themselves changed. The walls between them had not vanished, but they had become transparent, allowing the light of shared sorrow and quiet hope to filter through. One evening, as snow drifted silently against the window and the house lay quiet, Nathaniel found Eleanor in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she kneaded dough. "May I help?" he asked, a hesitant smile on his lips. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. "If you don't mind getting your hands dirty." He joined her, their fingers brushing as they worked the dough. Laughter bubbled between them, easy and unforced. For a moment, Eleanor forgot her sorrow, forgot the weight of memory. She glanced at Nathaniel, catching the warmth in his eyes, and her heart fluttered with something dangerously close to longing. Later, as she washed her hands at the sink, Nathaniel lingered nearby, his gaze searching. "I never meant to hurt you, Eleanor. If I could take back what happened, I would." He hesitated, his voice low. "I care for you, more than I have words for." Eleanor's breath caught. She looked away, her heart torn. "I don't know if I can ever forgive, not fully. It feels like betraying Samuel to even try." Nathaniel's expression was gentle, understanding. "I would never ask you to forget him. He deserves to be remembered. But I hope, in time, you might find space for something new." The words lingered in the quiet, both of them suspended between past and future. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the wind. She turned Samuel's journal over in her hands, tracing his name with her thumb. The ache remained, sharp and real, but no longer the only thing she felt. Nathaniel's kindness, his honesty, the way he had worked beside her, all of it unsettled her, warming something in her heart she was afraid to name. The days grew lighter, the promise of thaw stirring beneath the snow. As Eleanor watched Nathaniel from the window, his coat dusted with frost, his hands strong and sure, she wondered if, after so much sorrow, she dared hope for a second chance. But the fear remained. To move forward would be to risk letting go, and she was not yet certain she could. Yet even as winter lingered, a quiet spark had been kindled between them, one that neither grief nor guilt could easily extinguish. And somewhere beyond the snowbound fields, the uncertain dawn of a new season waited, holding its breath for what might come next. A pale, uncertain sun was rising over Willow Creek when the coach clattered into town, its wheels cutting new ruts through the last of the spring mud. Eleanor, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's baking, glanced out the kitchen window as a tall figure stepped down onto the road, pausing to shake out his fine coat. Something in his bearing, proud, brisk, utterly out of place, sent a ripple of apprehension through her. Mrs. Mabry saw it too, her brow knitting. Eleanor did not have to wait long to discover the visitor's identity. He arrived on the porch, boots spotless, hair gleaming with pomade, and rapped smartly at the door. When Mrs. Mabry opened it, he smiled with studied warmth. "Good morning. I am Edward Linton, Eleanor's cousin. I have come from Boston." Eleanor's heart thudded. She wiped her hands and forced herself to greet him, caught between delight at a reminder of home and dread at what his presence might mean. "Edward," she said, surprised by how formal her voice sounded. "What brings you to Willow Creek?" He studied her closely, as if searching for signs of hardship. "You, of course. I could hardly leave you to languish here. Not after all that's happened." He took her hand, lowering his voice. "You look tired, Eleanor. This place, surely it is beneath you." Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. "I am well enough. Please, come in." Nathaniel, returning from his morning rounds, paused at the threshold, hat in hand, eyes flickering from Edward to Eleanor. He nodded politely, though his posture stiffened. Edward, undeterred, introduced himself. "Mr. Reed, I presume. I have heard much about you." He turned back to Eleanor. "May we speak privately, cousin?" Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Eleanor, searching for her wishes. She nodded, uncertain. They settled in the parlor, the fire banked low. Edward wasted no time. You must come home, Eleanor. Your place is with your family, your true family. Boston society will welcome you back, especially now that your mourning period has ended. There are opportunities, doors that will close forever if you tarry here. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Boston is not what it was. My parents are gone. My life is here now. Edward shook his head, his expression grave. You could have a new life, a better one. You have prospects admirers who would cherish you, give you comfort and security. Not this, exile. She bristled. I'm not an exile. I chose this. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Do you know what people say about Nathaniel Reed? His name is tainted, Eleanor. There are rumors, dark ones, about his conduct during the war, about how he treats his wife. If you stay, you will be stained by association. You deserve more. Eleanor's jaw tightened. You know nothing of him. Edward's eyes softened, almost pitying. I only want to spare you pain. Samuel would want the same. The invocation of her brother's name struck its mark. Eleanor felt the old ache rise up, mingling with guilt and confusion. A floorboard creaked outside the door. Nathaniel's shadow flickered in the hallway, retreating. He had heard enough. After Edward left her to rest, Eleanor found herself pacing the garden, the air thick with the scent of thawing earth and uncertainty. Nathaniel waited by the gate, hands thrust into his coat pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon. She stopped beside him, unsure how to begin. He spoke first, his tone quiet. Your cousin is right in some ways. I can't offer you a life free of shadows. My past will always be with me and with you, if you stay. Eleanor's chest tightened. I haven't made any decisions. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes dark with pain. You should choose what's best for you, Eleanor. Not for me, not even for Samuel's memory. Just for you. She could find no words, torn between gratitude for his honesty and the fear that, in choosing him, she would betray everything she once held dear. The day wore on, the tension unresolved, until a frantic knocking shattered the uneasy stillness. Mrs. Granger stood on the porch, breathless and wild-eyed. It's Clara, she gasped. She's burning with fever. I'm afraid, please, come quickly. Eleanor's heart lurched. She ran for her cloak, Nathaniel close behind. They found Clara curled in bed, her skin clammy and cheeks flushed red. The child whimpered, delirious, as Mrs. Granger wrung her hands. Eleanor took command, her voice steady. We'll need cool cloths, willow bark tea and broth. Nathaniel, fetch the doctor if you can. I'll go, he said, already moving. Through the long hours of the night, Eleanor battled Clara's fever, wiping her brow, coaxing sips of water, whispering soothing words. When Nathaniel returned alone, the doctor stranded by a flooded creek, he joined her, stoking the stove, carrying water, holding Clara's hand as she shivered and cried out for her mother. Between each ragged breath, Eleanor felt the wall between her and Nathaniel crumble. Their hands brushed as they worked, silent understanding passing between them. At dawn, Clara's fever broke. The girl slept, her breathing slow and even. Eleanor sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face. Nathaniel reached for her, hesitated, then drew her into a gentle embrace. She did not resist, resting her head against his shoulder. We did it, she whispered. He squeezed her hand. You did. You saved her. They watched Clara sleep, their exhaustion edged with hope. In that quiet, Eleanor felt the first fragile threads of forgiveness stir within her. The pain of Samuel's loss had not vanished, but it no longer eclipsed everything else. As the sun rose over Willow Creek, Eleanor knew her choice was not yet made, but for the first time, she saw the possibility of a future shaped by something more than grief. And as the day brightened, she realized the next test was yet to come, waiting just beyond the threshold of morning. Spring crept into Willow Creek with a hush of green and gold, unfolding the prairie from its winter shroud. Buds tipped the branches in the garden, and the scent of thawed earth drifted through open windows. In that gentle transformation, Eleanor found herself daring to hope again. The pain of the past had not vanished, but its sharpest edges had softened, replaced by something new, something tender and uncertain. The rhythm of her days changed. She and Nathaniel moved through the house as partners, not strangers. One morning, Eleanor caught him humming at the stove, sleeves rolled and hair tousled as he flipped corncakes for breakfast. She laughed, surprised by the ease between them. "You never told me you could cook," she teased, nudging his elbow. Nathaniel grinned, a boyish dimple creasing his cheek. "Only when absolutely necessary." Jacob and I nearly burned down the barn trying to boil eggs once. Eleanor leaned against the counter, warmth blooming in her chest. "You never speak of your brother." Nathaniel's smile faded to something softer. "Jacob was wild, always leading me into trouble. He died before the war ended. I think of him every day." His voice grew quiet. "Sometimes I envy the way you remember Samuel. My memories of Jacob are scattered, like pages torn from a book." Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch gentle. "Samuel was always the brave one. I spent years living in his shadow, wishing I could be more like him. When he died, I felt as if part of myself had vanished too." She hesitated. "But I'm tired of living in the past. I want to build something new." Nathaniel squeezed her fingers. "I want that too, Eleanor, more than anything." Their moments together grew in number and in meaning. They planted seedlings in the garden, their hands stained with dirt and laughter, mingling on the breeze. Nathaniel taught her to fish in the slow, winding creek beyond the meadow, and when she slipped on the mossy bank and tumbled into the water, his laughter was so unguarded, so free, that Eleanor could not help but join him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies wink above the grass, Nathaniel spoke of his dreams. "I used to imagine leaving all this behind, starting fresh in California, maybe. But now," he turned to her, searching her eyes, "I want to make Willow Creek into a home, a place where people can forgive and begin again. I want that with you, if you can find it in your heart." Eleanor's breath caught. "I'm afraid, Nathaniel. Afraid to let myself be happy. Afraid I'll betray Samuel, or lose myself again." He reached out, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "We can be afraid together. I promise you. I'll never ask you to forget him, or your pain, only to let me share it." The quiet stretched between them, full of meaning. Then gently, Nathaniel leaned forward. Eleanor met him halfway, their lips brushing in a hesitant, trembling kiss, one that tasted of longing, forgiveness, and hope. When they parted, Eleanor's cheeks were wet with tears, but her heart felt light for the first time in years. Their happiness was fragile, a secret they cradled between them. The town, sensing the shift, grew warmer in its welcome. Children greeted Eleanor at the market, and Mrs. Granger pressed fresh eggs into her hands with a wink. Nathaniel's presence beside her protective, steadfast became a source of pride rather than shame. But shadows lingered at the edge of the thawing prairie. One afternoon, as Eleanor gathered herbs from the garden, she heard angry voices from the square. She hurried into town to find a knot of men gathered by the livery, their faces red with drink and resentment. Jasper, Lila's brother, stood at their center, his Confederate coat still clinging to his frame, though years had passed since Appomattox. Jasper's voice rang out sharp and bitter. "Sheriff Reed thinks he owns this town, but folks haven't forgotten what he did during the war, how he treated prisoners, how he let good men die. Are we to let a murderer judge us?" The crowd murmured, torn between old loyalties and new peace. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding. "That's enough, Jasper," she called. "Nathaniel Reed has risked his life for Willow Creek more times than I can count. He saved your own neighbors from sickness and fire. He is no murderer." Jasper sneered. "You'd defend him, would you? Even after what he did to your brother?" Eleanor's voice shook, but she stood her ground. "Samuel's death was a tragedy of war, not murder. I choose to stand by Nathaniel. I know his heart." The crowd wavered, uncertain. Jasper spat on the ground, but others hung their heads, unwilling to meet Eleanor's gaze. Nathaniel appeared at her side, his hand hovering protectively at her back. He met Jasper's glare with calm resolve. "We can't change the past," Nathaniel said, "but we can choose who we are now." The standoff ended with muttered curses and a few men drifting away. But Eleanor knew the trouble was not over. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, and the town was split, some siding with Jasper's bitterness, others with Nathaniel's hope. That night, as the moon rose over Willow Creek, Eleanor lay awake, turning the day's events over in her mind. Nathaniel entered her room, his face drawn with worry. "I'm sorry you had to stand up for me," he murmured. She shook her head. "I did it for both of us, for Samuel, for Jacob, for everyone who deserves a second chance." He knelt by her side, taking her hand. "I don't want you to be in danger." "Not for my sake." Eleanor squeezed his fingers, her voice trembling. "We face it together. That's what it means to build a life." In the hush that followed, Nathaniel pressed a kiss to her brow, and Eleanor closed her eyes, trusting the warmth of his touch. Outside, the prairie trembled with the promise of storms to come. The past had not finished with them, nor the town, with its reckonings. But for the first time, Eleanor did not feel alone in the fight. As thunder rumbled in the distance, she drew Nathaniel's hand to her heart, vowing that, come what may, she would not let go. And in the darkness, hope flickered, fierce and stubborn, refusing to be extinguished. A storm gathered over Willow Creek, not of rain, but of rumor and resentment. The town meeting was called for sunset, the air thick with anticipation as men and women crowded into the clapboard hall, lanterns flickering against the gathering dark. Eleanor sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, heart drumming in her chest. Nathaniel stood beside her, every inch the sheriff's shoulders squared, face set, but she felt the tension in his clenched jaw, the memories clawing at him beneath the surface. Jasper stood before the crowd, his voice sharp and clear. "We all know why we're here. Nathaniel Reed claims to be a man of law, but he carries the blood of good men on his hands. My brother never came home from Cold Spring, and he wasn't the only one. Are we to let a war criminal wear a badge in Willow Creek?" A murmur swept the room. Lila, at Jasper's side, glared at Eleanor with undisguised fury. Nathaniel's voice rang out, calm but heavy. "You have every right to ask questions. I will answer them." He stepped forward, meeting the crowd's eyes one by one. "During the war, I did what I believed was right. I made decisions that haunt me still. I lost men, good men, like Samuel Whitaker, like Jacob Reed. I did not seek glory. I did not seek death. I did my duty." Jasper spat on the floor. "Easy to say now that the war's over and your hands are clean." Lila's voice trembled. "You sent my brother to die. You never answered for it." Eleanor stood, her voice trembling but clear. "I have something to share." She lifted Samuel's journal, the leather worn thin from years of grief. "This is my brother's. His last entry was written the night before Cold Spring. May I read it?" Pastor Willoughby nodded gravely. "Let her speak." Eleanor opened the journal, her voice steadying as she read. "We march tomorrow. There is fear in every man's eyes, even Nathaniel's. I do not know if I will see home again, but I believe in forgiveness. If I fall, I hope those left behind will find peace. War must end somewhere. Let it end with us." Silence swept the room. Eleanor looked up, tears shining in her eyes. Samuel did not blame Nathaniel. He knew the cost of war. He wanted peace for all of us. "I have learned to forgive, not because I forget, but because I must go on living." A hush fell. Several townsfolk nodded, moved by her words. Mrs. Granger dabbed her eyes. Pastor Willoughby murmured a prayer. But Lila and Jasper stood unmoved, bitterness written in every line of their faces. Jasper's voice rose again. "Pretty words, but they don't change the truth. You can dress up murder in forgiveness, but it's still murder." The meeting dissolved into heated whispers. Some men muttered their support for Nathaniel, others eyed him with suspicion. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze. The town balanced on a knife's edge. That night, the wind shifted restless, warning. Nathaniel and Eleanor returned home in silence. Mrs. Mabry locked the doors, her eyes darting to the windows. Nathaniel checked his rifle, jaw set. "Stay close tonight," he told Eleanor. "Something's brewing." She nodded, heart pounding. Shadows flickered on the walls as the lanterns burned low. Outside, a horse whinnied, then a crash splintered the night. Glass shattered in the parlor. A stone rolled to a stop at Eleanor's feet, its surface smeared with tar. Voices rose outside, angry and slurred. "Traitor! Murderer! Show yourself!" Nathaniel took Eleanor's arm, pulling her behind him. "Stay here," he whispered, slipping into the hallway. She watched, fear and fury mingling as he faced the front door. The wood shuddered under pounding fists. Then, with a roar, the door burst open. Jasper and two men surged inside, faces masked by scarves. Nathaniel wrestled with them, the struggle fierce and desperate. Eleanor, trembling, snatched the poker from the hearth and struck one attacker's arm, sending him reeling. Jasper swung a club, catching Nathaniel across the ribs. Nathaniel grunted, but did not fall. "Enough!" he shouted. "This ends here." One man fled, but Jasper lunged again. Eleanor darted forward, blocking his path. "You'll have to go through me," she said, voice shaking. Jasper hesitated, wild-eyed. "He's not worth it, Eleanor. He's my husband. I love him," she cried, surprising herself as much as Jasper. Nathaniel staggered, blood seeping from his side. The last attacker fled into the night. Jasper glared at them both, then turned and ran. The house fell silent, but for the labored breathing of those left behind. Eleanor knelt beside Nathaniel, her hands slick with blood. "You're hurt. Let me help." He tried to protest, but she pressed a cloth to his wound, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered fiercely. "I was afraid for so long, afraid to love you, afraid to forgive. But I do, Nathaniel. I love you. I need you." Nathaniel's hand found hers, his grip weak but sure. "I love you, Eleanor. I always have." She dressed his wound with trembling fingers, her heart breaking and healing all at once. By morning, word of the attack had spread. The townspeople, shocked by the violence, rallied to their side. Mrs. Granger and Pastor Willoughby arrived with food and bandages. Even old Mr. Dobbins stood guard on the porch, rifle in hand. Neighbors spoke out, shaming Jasper and Lila. One by one, the town declared their support for Nathaniel and Eleanor, their loyalty sealed by the blood spilled in the night. As Nathaniel rested, Eleanor sat at his bedside, hope and dread warring in her chest. Their love, tested by fire, had survived, but the future remained uncertain, and danger still lingered on the horizon. In the hush before dawn, Eleanor took Nathaniel's hand and whispered a promise. Whatever trials awaited, she would face them at his side, no matter the cost. Nathaniel's recovery was a slow and stubborn thing, measured in the steady rise of color to his cheeks and the gradual easing of pain in his side. The wound Jasper left behind ached in the mornings and burned when the storms rolled in. But Eleanor was always there, her hands gentle, her voice a balm. She moved through the days with quiet resolve, tending the bandages, reading aloud from Samuel's journal, and bringing the world to his bedside with stories of the schoolchildren and the slow unfolding of spring on the prairie. The town, once so wary and divided, now rallied around them. Mrs. Granger arrived each morning with a basket of fresh bread or preserves. Old Mr. Dobbins chopped wood for the stove and kept a watchful eye on the property. Pastor Willoughby stopped by with prayers and laughter, and even the children left wildflowers on the porch, their faces shy and hopeful. Lila and Jasper, stripped of their allies and shunned by the community, packed their belongings and slipped away before dawn. No one saw them off. Their absence felt less like a victory than a lifting of a storm, an uneasy peace replacing the threat of violence. The scars they left behind would linger, but for the first time, Willow Creek began to heal. As Nathaniel regained his strength, the house itself seemed to mend. The broken window was replaced, the front door reinforced. Eleanor scrubbed the soot from the walls and aired the linens in the sun. Together, they painted the porch rails and replanted the garden, side by side, as neighbors paused at the gate to offer help or a word of encouragement. There were days when the past crept in, a remembered argument, a shadow passing over Nathaniel's face, a pang of longing for Samuel that caught Eleanor off guard. But the old wounds lost their power to wound anew. Instead, they became something the couple could hold between them, acknowledging the ache but refusing to be defined by it. One afternoon, Nathaniel found Eleanor standing in the garden, her hands dusted with soil, her eyes lifted to the sky. He watched her for a moment before joining her, his arms settling around her waist. "Do you ever wish you could change it all?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, a small smile curving her lips. "No, not now. I wouldn't trade this for anything." He drew her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "I spent years believing I didn't deserve happiness, that I was cursed to carry my guilt alone. You taught me there's more to life than regret." Eleanor touched his cheek. "We both lost so much. But we found each other, Nathaniel. We built something new from what was broken." Their wedding was a small, sunlit affair in the garden, with wildflowers twined along the fence and the scent of fresh bread drifting from Mrs. Granger's kitchen. Pastor Willoughby spoke simply, blessing their union in words that echoed through the quiet prairie. Friends and neighbors gathered, their faces shining with joy. Clara scattered petals along the path, and even stoic Mr. Dobbins wiped a tear from his eye. As Nathaniel slipped a ring onto Eleanor's finger, his hand steady and warm, she felt the last of her fear melt away. They spoke their vows not as strangers bound by duty or grief, but as partners equals who had chosen each other against the odds. After the ceremony, the townsfolk lingered, sharing laughter, music, and memories. The bitterness of the past was not forgotten, but it no longer held sway. Eleanor watched the sunlight dance across the fields and felt the weight of Samuel's absence, but also his blessing. She knew, deep in her heart, that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing love, again and again, each new day. That evening, as dusk painted the prairie in shades of gold and lavender, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on the porch, hand in hand, gazing out over the land that had become their home. The air was filled with the music of crickets and the scent of wild roses. Nathaniel squeezed her hand. "We made it, Eleanor. After everything, we're still here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment blooming within her. "We are. And I think Samuel would be proud. I know I am." He kissed her temple, his voice low and steady. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." They stood in silence, watching the sky deepen, their hearts finally at rest. The pain of the past had not vanished, but it had been transformed, woven into the promise of a life rebuilt, a love hard-won and fiercely kept. And as the first stars appeared, Eleanor felt peace settle around them like a blessing, fragile, precious, and utterly theirs.